Okay, we quickly pick up to finish up motivation. So again, what does neuroscience say? As you see here with these two different, in a sense, processing systems for emotion, we see that both an automatic response and a more thoughtful response are actually possible within the brain itself. Again, going back to our three theories, James Lange and Cannon-Bard are supported very well by the unconscious processing system within the brain. And then the Schachter theory that gives us much more credit for thinking through, or at least having some control over our emotions, is well supported by this second theory that says we use explicit memory as a basis, generate emotion more slowly, work more deliberately, and accesses the cortex, meaning the conscious part of the brain, and is more thoughtful. So this is a great case of where neuroscience supports the theoretical ideas that were there before. All right, moving on, more on achievement as a motivator. What you see here are three separate images from a test called the thematic apperception test. And this is a test that's often used by psychologists to look for the motives that might actually be behind people's behaviors and lifestyle choices. This particular test is a projective test, which means that you project your own feelings onto these images. So how do you do this? The test will have a series of images like the ones you see, and these are from the original thematic apperception test. And then you're asked to describe the scenario that you're seeing. Now, what researchers are looking for in a projective test is consistency. So you'll probably, if you were to take this test in a legitimate way, you'd see about 25 different images, and you'd have to come up with what you saw or what you think you were seeing in each one. And they look for specifically, when it comes to the difference between achievement and affiliation in motivation, whether or not you focus on the idea of someone within the image achieving something or trying to gain a goal or looking at the power struggle between people, or are you looking more at, and do you describe more often, the emotions that people are feeling or their connection to each other? In other words, looking more at the affiliation idea. So it's a very interesting way of trying to figure out what is, at least at that moment in time, tends to be the most important motivator for someone. So you can see these three different images, and if your answers were more related to the people worrying about their relationships, you'd probably have a higher affiliation motive. If you looked more at them and talked about the power that was being wielded by either person, or about how they were competing or how they were driving or striving to do a particular thing, then you were probably more focused on achievement as your motivation. High achievement people work harder, are more persistent, handle negative feedback better, more future oriented, delay gratification, usually make more moderate choices, which is pretty interesting. Now, the guy who came up with this was David McClellan, who did quite a bit of research on this. You see him there in the right corner. And his argument about high achievement people is that they are not gamblers, but they're challenged to win by personal effort, not necessarily by good luck. So, surprisingly, the people who are considered to be high achievement people tend to choose more moderate difficulty in the tasks that they actually take on. So you would think high achievement people might try to always reach for the stars in a sense, but in reality they usually have more applicable and moderate goals that they're reaching for. Alright, now we're going to move to stress and health, and if you want to pull up the PowerPoint yourself, you may do so, but of course it's here on the video. So we're going to take a look at how stress is, what the source of stress is, how you cope with it, and that's the official term we're trying to deal with stress, is coping. What happens to you biologically as a result of stress, and of course the mental component to it. So, sources of stress. Stress refers to psychological tension or strain, the uncomfortable emotional and bodily responses to stressful situations. So, both mental and physical. And adjustment is any attempt, successful or not, to cope with stress, an attempt to balance our needs against the demands of the environment, and to weigh our desires against realistic possibilities and to manage them as well as we can. So, these two terms are pretty important, stress and adjustment, obviously. So let's take a look at the sources of stress. And it's not just teachers or tests or having to listen to videos, but it's the idea that sources of stress include something amazingly called stressors. These are events or circumstances that trigger stress. They vary in intensity and duration, from the mild, short-lived aggravation of misplacing your keys or something like that, or the prolonged tragedy of caring for a parent who has Alzheimer's or something along those lines. What's interesting is that the same event, say a chemistry exam, may be a stressor for one person and not another, and in fact it might be a stressor for a particular person at one point, but not as much at another point. So stress is not limited to life and death situations or even unpleasant experiences. Even happy occasions can be stressors because they require us to change or adapt in order to meet our needs. For example, a wedding is a stressful situation, as well as exciting, because most weddings are very complicated and difficult to arrange. You've got all the in-laws and all the other things that are going on there. So now let's take a look at two major sources of stress. But before we do that, let's look at the difference here between acute and chronic. So again, stressors trigger stress, and the key is our perception of our ability to handle or cope with the stress that we actually have to deal with. So there's two types: acute, and that's limited. So that's something that has a short lifespan. You know it's going to end, something like being in traffic. Chronic stress, of course, would be something where there's no end in sight. A high-pressure job, the fact that you have to get through a particular thing that's going to take a long time, and again, not limited to life or death situations. So this is a great example of the influence of both mind and body, because the way you perceive stress has a huge impact on your physical condition, and the brain itself and your autonomic system and all kinds of other systems get involved in this particular situation. Okay, again, stress is not limited to life and death. Types include life changes, and we'll take a look at this next slide. You see here the Holmes Rahe life stress inventory, and what they've done is they've basically through interviews and surveys of thousands and thousands of people, they've come up with a value of stress that they see for these particular events. Now, some of these are obviously pretty negative. The idea of in-law troubles or being fired at work or divorce or death of a spouse. These things are all pretty understandable to cause stress. But if you look at some of these other ones, there's actually things that you wouldn't think necessarily, just change in residence, changing to a new school, which many of you will be doing in not too long from now. Vacation, which is supposed to be a fun thing, and yet it can cause stress too. So you put all those things together and add up your score as it shows here, and it will tell you that if you have a really high score, it's something you need to definitely consider. So hassles are a type of stress, so let's take a look at those. Much stress is generated by petty annoyances, and those are called everyday hassles. The researcher Robert Lazarus believed that big events matter so much because they trigger numerous little hassles that eventually overwhelm us with stress. And within these hassles, there are three types of hassles. The first being pressure, and of course, pressure occurs when we feel forced to speed up, intensify, or shift directions in our behavior, or when we feel compelled to meet a higher standard of performance. Pressure on the job, or you would see it in school, is a familiar example. Sometimes companies and even schools attempt, and I know we have at Ursuline, to find ways of trying to lower your stress and the pressure that's involved that helps to create it. Sometimes successfully, sometimes not so much. A second type of hassle is frustration. Frustration occurs when a person is prevented from reaching a goal because someone or something stands in the way. A high school student with great SATs and a high average does not get into an Ivy League school, and so that's definitely something that will cause frustration. A woman does not receive a promotion on the grounds that she does not have experience in the particular area that she'd like. Scientist's budget is cut just when he or she feels close to a breakthrough. So there's all kinds of things that can lead to this idea of frustration. And then, of course, we can actually create some subcategories, including the types of frustration. Delays are annoying because our culture puts great stock in the value of time. There's the lack of resources, and this is frustrating to those Americans who cannot afford the things that they think they need in order to live the life that they believe they should live, including, and to some extent, the unreasonable lifestyle that we get through the media, which, again, is pretty interesting. We actually create stress when we don't really need it. There's, of course, losses, such as the end of a relationship or a friendship. This can cause frustration because it often makes us feel helpless, unimportant, or worthless. Failure can generate intense frustration and accompanying guilt in our competitive society. Our culture holds that success and failure depend on your individual talent and effort, not luck, not good fortune, or simply being in the right place at the right time. We imagine that if we had done things differently, we might have succeeded. Thus, we usually feel personally responsible for our setbacks and tend to assume that others blame us for not trying harder or being smarter. Now, discrimination also frustrates us. Being denied opportunities or recognition simply because of some category that we are in definitely causes us to feel that life is unfair and definitely causes frustration. One example of frustration is, of course, road rage. We'll get into some of the theories about that in a second, but it's obviously become more common and more dangerous. One survey found that 9 in 10 drivers had been threatened by speeding, tailgating, people who failed to yield right-of-way, lane changes without signaling, and all the other things you can think of, provocative gestures, etc., within the last year. So road rage seems to be increasing, and of course, as more cars get on the road, the chances of that are actually increase exponentially. Research on road rage as a behavior syndrome see it as rooted in our annoyance with delays and our winner-take-all view of competition. What surprised researchers is how many aggressive drivers are in normal life ordinary people with no history of violence, and how many consider themselves to be victims of inconsiderate drivers. We'll come back to, well, let's go ahead and go to road rage now real quickly and talk about the theories. There's actually 3 main theories of why road rage seems to be occurring so much. First is the crowding hypothesis. Let's see, there we go. There's road rage, the Jekyll and Hyde effect, and again, this is the idea that people who are very normally calm and logical and all those things seem to lose it on the highways or on the streets. So here are our main theories. The crowding hypothesis: more cars equals more traffic, more frustration, more stress, more anger, more hostility, more violence. So basically we're smashed together. Number 2, the cultural hypothesis. Americans learn aggressive and dangerous driving patterns as children by watching their parents and other adults behind the wheel and by viewing risky driving in movies and television commercials. Interestingly enough, this research actually prompted an advertising campaign that some of you may be familiar with. And this particular campaign actually had images and videos of adults driving and being pretty crazy on the roads and watching the children respond, and then the children would actually model that behavior. And so this research actually points out that just as Bandura would say, that people often learn their bad driving habits from those who they watch drive before them, and that's definitely their parents. And then finally, the third theory is the displacement hypothesis. People are more likely to lose their tempers while driving if they've suffered recent blows to their self-esteem, and they seek to recoup their sense of worth by winning battles on the road. Now, this particular theory makes a lot of sense because it also tells you a little bit about why anytime you're confronted with this type of situation that you should back off and not try to get involved at all. And the reason is it's the other person's problem. We're going to be talking specifically as we move forward about how you need to make sure that you control your own world and not allow other people to cause you to have certain feelings or thoughts about yourself, and realize that you decide what you feel and how you behave. And in this case, this is a great example. Let the other person who's having the trouble go. Remember that there's no way that following them and being in a road rage incident could ever be worth it. And we'll pick up with this on the next video.